book reviews, there is of course a huge amount to get through, because this also includes sort of recent sort of acquisitions. It's a bit of a book haul as well, and I thought I'd do this without any preamble, any of the credits, the usual stuff, because I've just spent so much time editing this week looking at the material I shot in Italy that I just want to do something straightforward and sort of reground things with a bit of SF, because I've been back from Italy a week and I'm still absolutely wired and exhausted. Went back to work and what have you, and you know, it was a working holiday, so a YouTube holiday, so there wasn't a lot of, you know, real chilling, as you will see from the vlog. If you haven't watched the vlog, I know a lot of you, there we go, I know a lot of you are only here for the SF, but you will understand the SF more and you will enjoy what I'm saying about SF more if you watch my other stuff, because this is an interdisciplinary channel and science fiction doesn't exist in a bubble, and there will be stuff in the Capri videos about SF, including some specific videos about specific books and writers, which will surprise you. So there we go. Let me throw that watch aside and we'll carry on. So I was going to do one of these review things every month and I haven't really got around to it, but of course a lot of things I've been reading have had their own features on the channel, Nina Allen, M. John Harris and what have you. So I thought we'd have a look at what I've read in the last month, and there's been other things as well, and I don't have it all here, and I don't keep a notebook, and if it's not particularly good I won't always remember. But first of all, a shout out to Dave B. I'm not going to try and say Dave's name because I'm bound to mispronounce it, but I'll flash on the screen. Thanks very much, Dave. He's a bookseller, small press guy, does lots of interesting stuff, and he sent me some things from the EasterCon, which was really kind of him. Thanks a lot, mate. And something I've been flicking through, which is something I never got around to buying, is Parietal Games, Critical Writings by and on M. John Harrison. So that's a look at M. John's lit crit, and also, you know, a compilation of his own lit crit, a lot of which was in New Worlds and I've read, and it's absolutely great, loving it. And you know, I'm still staggered by M. John's talent despite having read for nearly 40 years. So Dave, thanks very much for that. I never got around to buying it, so that's a bit of a fail. He also got me some other things. He got me this lovely John Brunner chapbook, While There's Hope, which has got some sort of nice illustrations and stuff in it, and it's the kind of thing that, you know, people used to do in the sort of 70s and 80s in the sort of SF world, little bits and pieces. And I don't really know what this is yet. It's let's see. Okay. It is a story within a moral which envisages a future in which an ingenious stratagem by the peace movement to save the world from nuclear destruction. And of course John was involved with the CND and what have you, and he wrote a novel called The Days of March, a mainstream novel which was published by Kerosinas in the Kerosina videos, so do watch that. So yeah, again, another cracking little chapbook for the collection. Something which Dave is involved with as a writer, editor and publishing. And there's the man there. Okay. BRZESKI, and this is Occult Detective magazine, which he sent me a gratis copy of. Issue 9, winter 22-23, so it's obviously a quarterly, over 200 pages of great new fiction articles and reviews. So yeah, so isn't that lovely? Beautiful piece of work there, Dave. And again, I'm yet to look through it properly, but there's all sorts of people in it. Not many names I recognise. There's non-fiction, there's fiction, there's reviews, lots of stories. So yeah, so that will get me up to date maybe on what's happening in the weird fiction end of things. Beautiful stuff. So that might be one for you weird fiction guys. Also, Dave got me a couple of copies of Sex and the Black Machine, this Brian Aldiss cut-up chapbook from Avernus, who were a publisher who specialised in doing Brian's stuff. And it's got all sorts of bizarre pictures and weird text. So he's taken the Burroughsian things. So it's very new wave. Lovely. So a nice sort of little bit of stash of things there from Dave. Something which I mentioned briefly in the title of my first episode of my Capri vlog, which I wanted to talk about more and I haven't. I thought I'd talk about it now just to get you interested, is I have read some Italian science fiction. It's really hard to get hold of. Not much is translated. This is probably one of the best things I've read, and this is Milaqua. By Nicola Pugliese, which literally means bad water, evil water, mal meaning bad and aqua meaning water. And this is almost like an Italian version of The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. It came out in the late 70s, and Puliesi, it was the only novel he ever wrote, and it was published in 1977, I think, and it was in print for about 12 days, literally. and it was published by Calvino, Italo Calvino. I don't think Italo Calvino was the publisher, because Italo Calvino, the writer, worked for one of the big Italian houses. I can't think whether it was Einaudi or Feltrini. I think it was Einaudi, because he was Primo Levi's editor as well. So huge major literary figure who worked for a major Italian publisher, rather like T.S. Eliot worked for Faber in the UK. And in this, it starts to rain for 4 days straight in Naples, which is quite near to Capri, where I was on my hauls, as it were. And buildings start to fall, coins start to sing, and it's all sorts of weird stuff happens, and it's a very, very interesting book. And this is from And Other Stories, which is a great little imprint. I'm not mad about this cover, and this was a freebie I got from the distributor, and this was 4 or 5 years ago. But anyway, as I say, it was in print for 12 days. It sold out. It had rave reviews in Italy, and it was never reissued because the author didn't want it reissued. And the reasons surrounding this are unclear and mysterious. Maybe he wasn't happy with it, but it was one of those things where it became a real cult book, went underground, and when he died, obviously, he couldn't block it anymore because he owned the copyright. So there you go. So Milaqua. So that's an interesting, fabulous Italian SF novel that you can get. Good stuff. So what have I actually been reading? Well, the sort of first thing I want to cover is Airside by Christopher Priest, which is the second new book by Christopher Priest in less than a year. And, Chris has been producing a lot recently, and there have been some mumblings saying that the last couple, Expect Me Tomorrow and The Evidence, weren't sort of quite up to his usual standard. But I think Chris has been going through a period of creativity where he's experimenting with things and he's having fun. And those last two had obviously strong elements of crime fiction in them. They were SF. They had SF groundings. The first one was a Dream Archipelago novel. Expect Me Tomorrow is about climate change. There's parts of it set in the future. It also refers to a real criminal case. But Airside is something different. And what I liked about this, I actually loved this. I polished this off really quickly. What I loved about Airside is that it really sort of focused on some of the obsessions that have been in Chris's life for a long time since he was a child. So you could say there's autobiographical elements to it, though I wouldn't say the central character, who is a film devotee, a film journalist called Justin, is a representative of Chris. I wouldn't say that. And the two obsessions are film and aircraft and air travel. And fundamentally, what this is about this young chap, and he is interested when he's young in a Hollywood actress called Jeanette Marchand, who is somebody who goes missing. She comes to the UK after the war to do some work on British films. She gets off the plane at the airport and goes missing, and nobody ever sees her again. So she's gone missing at an airport, because an airport's kind of a liminal space. It's a sort of place where people are moving around, all sorts of things are happening. Everybody's distracted or tired or impatient or what have you, and nobody essentially knows where they're going. And I find airports really disorienting, and they give me the fear. I get sort of really nervous, and it's that thing about not being in control, because you have to do the security, show your passport, whatever, and I don't feel in control. I feel, the unknown forces are in control of me, and I hate that. And this sort of plays on that. So Justin, he has a career, and you see him develop through his life as he gets into making notes about films, and he gradually becomes a reviewer. He has various relationships with people, and he wants to look back into the life of Jeanette Marchand. And solving the mystery is, it's not a crime novel. It's not a mystery novel. There is a mystery in it, but it's about more than that. It's about Hollywood. It's about acting. It's about film. There are references in this to the great French science fiction film Le Jetée, which was the inspiration for 12 Monkeys, which is partially set at an airport in France. And it's got these wonderful Ballardian moments where Chris investigates through the characters the sort of psychopathology of the airport and what it does to human consciousness, and how disorienting it can be and how clinical it can be. And I absolutely loved this. I thought it was great, and I zipped through it. It's very, very readable, and there is something in it. Is it a science fiction novel? Well, it's a funny thing. I would say that pretty much all of Chris's novels, with the possible exceptions of the glamour and the affirmation, and yet I regard the glamour as a science fiction novel because I think it's got a scientific base to it, are definitively SF. This one I'm not so sure, but there is something in this, there is a mystery in this which I'm not going to tell you about, which means that its genre status is unspecific and cannot be codified, rather like Silverberg's book Scars. And that's something which I really loved. And for Chris, that sort of thing is easy. I think it's his best book for some time. I mean, this is his best book going back before, I would say, An American Story. I think it's, if you go back before things like The Gradual, The Adjacent, I mean, I think this is in that ballpark. It's really good. And I loved all the stuff about aircraft, because Chris was a real aircraft buff when he was a kid and read a lot about them and was interested. And also he's a real sort of cineast as well. So this combines acting, mystery, airports, aircraft and film. Fascinating stuff. A great novel of ideas. Very, very readable. I think the thing with Chris is that what's happened here, I'll come back to this book, I'll tell you about that in a minute, is that really there was a stylistic shift in his work, which I perceived, between The Quiet Woman and The Prestige. And some of the glacial elements of his writing seemed to fall away. And I think he would say that they were stiff and that they were sort of new wave influenced and what have you, and they gradually fell away, and a more sort of fleet storytelling style where the words flowed and you move through the text rapidly, but you've got to keep aware of what's going on because there's all these different ideas and characters coming at you from all angles, and there's a kind of smoothness in there, but something was lost. And I do think that, you know, there was some change there, and you know what it was, I don't know. I did try to push Chris about this in the last interview we did, but the only thing I can think of is that it did coincide with the birth of his children, and I'm sure that's nothing to do with it, but I don't know enough about his personal life and what was going on with him at that point, because that was the point he moved from the West Country and we started seeing each other not so often. So, but yeah, this is good. I think this is the best Priest for years. He's engaged in another project at the moment, which I'm sworn to secrecy about, which is really, really exciting, and I simply can't wait for his next book. It's going to be a real game changer, but for now this is fantastic. Just to show you this is Titanium Noir by Nick Harker, which I'm sure you noticed because it was there, and I haven't read this yet. I only bought this a couple of days ago, and Nick Harker is the son of John le Carré, and this is his 5th novel, I believe. Let's see, yeah, Gone Away World, Angel Maker, Tiger Man and No Man. No Man was a massive big sort of post-cyberpunk Neil Stephenson type police procedural AI thriller. Really, really good, but it was huge. This for him is very small, and Titanium Man is, again, it's a detective story, but people get really hung up on this idea of, oh, it's a combination of crime and SF. You know, science fiction has used crime plots forever, and it's mostly about crimes of the future, dangerous things happening in the future, which are probably in most cases illegal. So this is what this is about, and this is about a detective who was caught in a murder case. And what's unusual about this is that the victim is something like 7 feet tall and 91 years old, but he looks young. That's because the murder victim is what you call a Titan, and Titans are a class of people, they're a minority, who are super intelligent, super rich, and they've been genetically altered, so they're physically big, they're physically giants, and they've had this sort of godlike gene therapy, and this is all about this murder, and I'm fascinated to see what this is like. If you've not read Harker, as I said, I invoke Neil Stephenson. He's a huge fan of William Gibson. He's not published as a genre writer. He's never been published with the words SF on the books, but they very much are SF, and he's a real cult figure, and I've read interviews with him. He's very interesting, so that's going to be the next thing I read, but I just popped it there just so you could see it, so I'll review that quite soon because it's quite short, and I'm hoping to really get into that this weekend because I can't wait. I'm very excited about it because it came out of nowhere. I went back to work and a friend of mine, I waved at him and said, look at this, and he said, yeah, he said, I was going to tell you about that because, you know, I've grabbed the only other copy we've got. So yeah, so we had those, and that's going to be exciting. Something that I was reading while I was away, which you'll have seen in the Cadbury vlog, is this book, The Weight of Numbers by Simon Ings. Now, if you don't know who Simon Ings is mostly these days he's a science journalist. He was one of the sort of people who came up after the Gene Rats in Interzone and the various anthologies in the UK in the early 90s. And the first thing I read by him was a wonderful Jerry Cornelius story called Bruised Time, which would have been about 92, which is absolutely fantastic, and I love it. And he's written quite a few SF novels. I've read a few of them. Some of them I'm going to reappraise. He has a very literary, very ornate, chewy difficult style at times, which sometimes gets in the way of what he's wanting to say. But he's not somebody who wants to make it easy for you. And I've read other things, but my favourite book by him, which is in one of my other videos, I think it's in my sort of top 5 or top 10 best this century, is Painkillers. And that is absolutely brilliant. I love that. That's my favourite book by Simon. It's really good. And The Weight of Numbers came out in 2006. I remember looking at it and I absolutely loved this cover. I never got around to buying it. And then a while ago I thought, I really want to read this because it just sounds fascinating. So I managed to get, I bought 2 copies online. They were like £2 each. I got them on eBay because even though it's available, I really like this livery, and it was a paperback original in the UK. There's a hardback in the States, and I'm looking for a mint one. This one isn't quite mint. The one I read in Italy is a different sort of copy. And to describe this, is it a science fiction novel? Well, it's not, but it feels like one. So it's a typical Slipstream novel. So when you're reading it, you keep thinking of science fiction because it has that feel where it's stepped back and it's really looking at the way that technology and change has altered human consciousness and human life. It reminded me quite a lot of this book, The House of Rumour by Jake Arnott, which came out about 2014, which again is one of my favourite novels this century. And it's comparable to this. And I'd say if you don't know this, look it up and read it. It's absolutely fantastic book. It's one of my favourite books of the last 20 years. And what it reminded me of is that it's kind of a secret history of the 20th century from the middle onwards, and House of Rumour does that as well. And House of Rumour does it with a lot of real people. There are some real characters in this. It's the sort of book that gets you going on to Google and Wikipedia just to check whether people are real or not. And it's multifaceted, and what it does, it sort of intertwines the lives of various people from about the beginning of World War II right the way through until the early 21st century, but it mostly focuses around events in the 60s. And it's astonishing, really, because the sort of fulcrum of it is the Apollo missions, Apollo 8, which was the one that didn't actually sort of go with the moon landing, is when they were testing things, what have you, and the moment when Apollo 11 lands and Armstrong gets out onto the surface, and those things stud the central part of the book. And it takes place right across the world. There's a lot in there about military and political problems in Mozambique. Those are the bits of the book I found the most difficult, because I really felt I should have looked up to find out what was going on, because Simon, he doesn't info dump a lot. You know, he puts it out there and you've got to sort of step up and grab it, and that's what's exciting about it. And there's also a lot about the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed when, you know, Cuban emigres to Florida wanted to get back to Cuba and overturn Castro and overturn Marxism there. It was supposed to be backed by the FBI and it failed, and it was all sort of after the JFK assassination. And that is sort of like a central fulcrum of some of the characters. And one of the characters is a former child soap opera star called Stacey Chavez, and she used to be in Grange Hill. The British viewers will know what Grange Hill is. And then she becomes like an anorexic performance artist, and that's quite disturbing. Also, there is a people trafficker who does seem to be on the side of the people he's trafficking rather than the West, as it were, but it's not a hand-wringing kind of thing. And there's a character called Nick Jinx, who is some sort of drifter whose identity and name changes. And there's also a look at a mathematician and philosopher called Anthony Burden, who is the guy who seems to knit the basics, the ideas of the internet and virtual reality through his maths work. And he becomes overwhelmed by numbers. And he has a brief homosexual affair with a very, very famous person who was real from the world of computer science. And it's really kaleidoscopic and staggering. It's the most sort of directly written of Simon's books. Stylistically, it's the plainest, but there are moments where words leap out of you because he chooses them so well. Other writers would have pulled them out, but he leaves them in. And it's a great book. I don't think I got everything out of it I should have in the first reading, because I was tired when I was on holiday. Tired on holiday, irony. And, you know, I'm going to go back to it. But it's a really great challenging read if you want something that's very broad in scope. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It's 400 pages. A lot of books of this kind would be 600. But it's great stuff. The Weight of Numbers. A wonderful Slipstream read from a writer, an SF writer, who deserves more attention. And maybe we'll do some more stuff on Simon coming up. And I would like to interview him one day, but I suspect his brain is too big for me to cope with. But there we go. Something else I read recently. A while ago, some of the guys on BookTube who do SF did a lot of stuff about The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, ecclesiastical SF. And, you know, it is a thread which comes up. And Matt at Bookpilled and I had this discussion where, you know, he was saying it is a strange thing that science fiction, which is about rationalism and the post-Enlightenment worldview, there seem to be quite a few narratives around religion. Classic things like, you know, Canticle for Leibowitz is one of them, and Case of Conscience by James Blish is the obvious one, and The Sparrow obviously was a popular one. This is another one, and this is The Book of Strange New Things by Michelle Faber. Now, recently, of course, I did a video where I talked about Under the Skin and the way it was received and the way that non-genre readers thought it was like staggeringly original, and you know, and I didn't basically, as good it was. And I did mention that I've always been put off reading this book, but the fact its title is so dull, The Book of Strange New Things. And you have a look at the back and it mentions the basic plot is about a guy who goes as a missionary to an alien planet, and he's a born-again Christian. And Book of Strange Things, obviously you think straight away it's the Bible, and it is. And it's a very big book, as you see, but Faber's very readable, so I decided to get through it. And this is, let's see, this is nearly 600 pages long, and for me that's a big book. And it's, you know, it's a testament to Faber's readability that, you know, he managed to hold my attention for all that time, because, you know, I do think a lot of big books are big for artificial commercial reasons. Can I get that to stand up? Probably not. Let's put the weight of numbers behind it. See, that'll hold it up, because the cover is quite beautiful in lots of ways. So it is one of these things. The missionary is basically mostly from his point of view, and he's going off this planet which has been discovered. It's the sort of only planet that's been discovered with intelligent life, and there are these aliens there who are vaguely humanoid. They're humanoid in basic shape, and there's a company which sets this up, and there isn't like a big conspiracy. You don't get a big political thing about what the company's actually doing, but people are carefully selected, sent out there, and the people on the planet at the settlement are fairly diffident and what have you, and you know, you keep waiting for something dramatic to emerge. It doesn't, but that's the thing with Faber. You keep reading it because the prose is so smooth and readable, and it's not hyper literary. He's not dropping in lots of verbosity for the sake of it. It's very, very accessible to read and smooth, and but it is very long. And the thing with the missionary is he seemed to be somebody very naive, and maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what Faber wanted to get over. It's about the naivety of the born-again Christian, where you surrender everything, you let things go, and you know, you don't sort of sweat it so much. You know, as an existentialist, I really struggle with that. So it was quite hard to believe in some ways, because it's a guy who used to be a drug addict, alcoholic and criminal and what have you, and he sort of turns his life around when he meets the woman who becomes his wife, who's a Christian as well. And there's exchanges of letters between them. You see them at the very beginning, where she is taking him to the spaceport where he's going to take off in the ship and zip off to this planet. And while the missionary is away on the alien planet, the wife is back on Earth, and she's sending messages, and things are getting increasingly dystopian and falling apart. There's all sorts of shortages, violence, what have you, and they become more and more separated. He's more and more obsessed with his work. The aliens have already had a couple of visiting pastors who seem to have converted some of them without too much difficulty. And, you know, they are ready and waiting for the new recruit, and they want to build a church and what have you. And it's a very strange narrative in that you keep expecting melodrama, and all you get is a kind of quiet drama. And the aliens are interestingly depicted. They're humanoid. They live in this sort of very arid landscape, and they knit their own clothes. They're physically indistinguishable from one another. You can't tell what sex they are. The only thing that separates them is they have different colour clothes, and they all weave their own clothes, and they're all different colours. And there's a wonderful sequence where, you know, their heads, well, I'm not going to go into it. There's a thing about reproduction, which is interesting, and you know, they cannot be discerned as individuals. They look the same, and they have these very bizarre heads. So it is readable. I did enjoy it, but I did wonder what the point was, and maybe I've missed something again. But it's weird. I mean, it's one of those things. One of the things about literary fiction is that a lot of people who like literary fiction, in parenthesis, in inverted commas, seem to think that good writing is enough. And Faber does write really beautifully, I have to say. And it was very much that case. I think if you had a genre science fiction novel packaged and published as SF, produced something like this, it would go down well with some and not with others, but it was sort of really a triumph of style over content in lots of ways. So I wouldn't rave about it, and yet I am held to hang on to it. And I do want to read more of his work, because there are some short stories which I'd like to try. So that was The Book of Strange New Things. But even though the central character was focused on religion and it was quoted occasionally, you didn't feel there was a big religious method. Maybe it was just the thing that they wanted to get across, the naivety or the simplicity of the faith or the beauty of that. But it remains an enigma, I have to say. So that's The Book of Strange New Things. So what I did then was I decided a while ago to reread some books by one of my favourite British SF writers, the late 70s and early 80s, and that's Garry Kilworth. And this is The Knight of Kedar, his second novel, which I've read several times. And this is Split Second, which is his, let's see, third novel. So this was one I'd read partly before and DNF'd, so I thought I'd go back to it. But just to talk first of all about The Knight of Kedar. Knight of Kedar is Garry's second novel, late 70s, and I absolutely love this book. It's fantastic, and this is a Faber hardcover. It had maybe one, maybe two print runs as a Penguin A format. And The Knight of Kedar is a kind of seed ship narrative, and it begins in a spaceship, and the spaceship is traveling through space, and everything's automatic, and there are basically the seeds and sperm on board for potential human beings, and everything's going on mechanically with the computers automatically, and a planet is sensed by the onboard computers to be colonized, and the process of maturation begins. The seed and the sperm meet and human beings begin to develop, but it's happening 18 times quicker than in a normal situation. And the human beings which are developing an embryo toward sort of birth are being sort of educated and fed information by the computers in a virtual sense. And when they're born, they're fully grown, they're sort of 18 or 20. But at a crucial point, something, and it's not made clear what, enters the spacecraft, and you're uncertain whether it's something which is just energy or whether it's organic. The implication is of organic, and that reminded me of the Quatermass experiment, what happens in that. And it interferes with the computers, and a crucial piece of information is lost. The reason why this expedition is ongoing and why these people are born on board, as it were, as opposed to being just in hypersleep. What's particularly interesting about this is that the cast and crew, as it were, are Middle Eastern. They're Muslims, and it does say at the beginning of the book, there's a little colophon descriptor that says nothing is intended in this book towards Islam but respect. So, and this is in the late 70s. Now, Gary's a very well-travelled man. He's travelled all over the world, and he's fantastic at depicting exotic locales, non-Western locales. So he's particularly good at alien planets and stuff like that. And he also sets books all around the world. And you get the situation then where the cast of characters are deposited on this planet, and they have to choose leaders, they have to survive, and they don't know why they're there, and they don't know how they got there. They only know they have memories which are virtual memories of their education and things, but they're all fake, of course, and they know they're fake, but they're real to them. So you see power struggles, you see a leader emerge, you see a rival, and there are some quasi-humanoid aliens on the planet already, but the sense of purpose is missing, and the Knight of Kedar means the Knight of Glory, and it's a fascinating book, and I've read it 3 times, and it's a small masterpiece. It's not front rank, it's not always as sophisticated as the work that Garry did a few years later in the 80s when he produced what I think are his best books, but it is really quite something, and there's something very, and I wouldn't use the word spiritual about it. There's a kind of calmness, and because the characters aren't Western, it's different. They have a kind of wisdom of their own, and they have spiky relationships. The leader and his matched wife don't always sort of get on. She's in some ways too powerful for him, but he's an interesting character as well, and it's good. So it's a book sort of, the narrative sort of comes out of what's missing as well as what's there. But yeah, that's a great one. So it's really good to reread it. I loved it. And I'm going to reread his first novel, In Solitary, which I think is really, really good. And I'm going to do a little feature about his SF. But as I say, I DNF'd this the first time around, and then I went back to it, and I really enjoyed it. And this is set on Cyprus. And I think Garry was stationed there when he was in the RAF at one point. And near future, and it's around the idea of a piece of tech has emerged which can read fossils and can read what the creatures looked like and what was happening to them in their lives. And it seems very uncertain, and it recreates it holographically. And there's a paleontological dig, and the guy who's the central character, he's not a pro. He's managed to get hold of this equipment, which is quite uncommon, still not fully understood. It's very expensive, and he's trying to pull himself out of a financial hole. He's divorced and remarried, and his son is with him, and they have this area where there are these Neanderthal fossils, and basically there's quite a few of them. It's an unprecedented find, and they set up the equipment to recreate what these people looked like and what they were doing at that point in that place in Cyprus. And you can feel the heat of the sun and the blue of the sea and what have you. And it's really fascinating, because what happens then, everybody can see the holographs of these beings, and the young boy who's a teenager touches one of them, and this intermingling of these beings across time takes place, and they fall into each other's consciousnesses, and at some point the young boy is thrown back into Neanderthal's body, into the days of the clash between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, and occasionally he's in the boy's body, and the boy's in a coma for a while after that. And there's other events going on behind it. There's a new partner of the central character's divorced wife, as it were, and there's a certain amount of daring do there, but that's kind of in the background. And it's really good because, you know, something that Garry, this is Faber, and Garry at that time, also in Faber, were Christopher Priest and Robert Holdstock. And Holdstock, of course, his early works are these anthropological SF novels set on other planets, but they feel a bit like Le Guin. You can feel her influence. You can also feel that whole Matter of Britain thing, and all that sort of focus on the Celtic and the pagan and the heathen, that early British thing which Robert was really interested in. And you can feel that kind of archaeological, paleontological thing, that weight of history coming into Garry's works, and maybe there was some sort of cross-referencing and sort of cross-influence there. But I really enjoyed this time, and great depiction of Cyprus, but very much a book of its time. The late 70s was interesting in SF because we'd had a new wave, and then it had infected the mainstream of SF, and there were some new things coming through, but there's very much a feeling in some quarters that we were waiting around for the next revolution. I mean, even Ballard was sort of coming up with things which were slightly anachronistic, like Hello America, which is a great book, but seemed more like a book from the 60s after his Urban trilogy. And Priest was moving more out of SF towards his sort of unreliable narrators and what have you. So there was sort of strange things going on in British SF. So it's sort of post-New Wave, and really good. Garry emerged when he won the Golang Sunday Times short story competition for a story called Let's Go to Golgotha, which is a little bit like Behold the Man. It's also a precursor of Gore Vidal's Life from Golgotha, and it has certain affinities with Stuart Jackman's The Davidson Affair as well. So interesting writer, always great backgrounds, and we're going to do something about him on the channel. And I'm even talked to him, you never know, because I'd met him a long time ago. We did an event a long time ago, and he's a heck of a nice guy. So that's that. So that was a bit of vintage reading. I'm sure I've read other stuff. I've been reading Colin Wilson's book on Wilhelm Reich, which I haven't finished yet, which I can't say I'm enjoying that much, but I might talk about that another time. But I'm going to take you through some things which I've bought which I haven't read yet. So this is the kind of book haul bit, just to show you what's out there. And this is a book which came out really recently, and the author is, let's see, Bulgarian? Yes, Bulgarian. And this is Georgy Gospodinov, Time Shelter, Georgi Gospodinov, Bulgarian. Interestingly, my book 100 must-read science fiction novels has been published in Bulgarian. I got an upfront payment. I've never got any royalties out of them. So if you're with a publisher and they say we want to do this in Bulgaria, then think again, because you'd be lucky to get any cash out of them. So there you go. So every single copy I've sold, I'm due a royalty, and I've never had any of it. It just like really winds me up, and I've got them myself and what have you. But maybe I'll try again at some point. It's probably like 50p or something anyway, but there you go. So anyway, Time Shelter, and this is from Weidenfeld and Nicholson. There we are. Quite interesting looking, as you see. And basically, Time Shelter is about an attempt to deal with people having dementia and struggling with the past, and this new idea comes up, and the basic idea is that the clinic of the past, where this building, they recreate rooms, and they're specifically designed for each sufferer from Alzheimer's, and each room represents a decade in tiny detail, so it transforms the person's consciousness back into that time, and the rooms become more and more convincing, and and like the way I popped that on there. And what happens is that people who don't have dementia and Alzheimer's start to want to move into this building to deal with their issues and their angst. But it sort of goes on from there. So that looks really interesting. So I thought that looked fantastic. So so the past and the present intersecting in the future. Wow. So that's Time Shelter. So we'll see what comes out of that. Just before I went off to Italy, I filmed an interview, which is not up on the channel yet. I'm still editing it, with two friends of mine, two writers, a guy called James Wright, who used to work with me a long time ago, and we were really good friends. We hadn't seen each other for 5 years, and he's written 6 novels, and one of them's an SF novel. There's another SF novel coming from him next year, and we just shot a sort of casual thing in the pub with him and a guy called Alistair McNaught, who's a Scots writer who did a really interesting book as well, and you'll see that coming up. But James and I started talking about Norman Mailer, the journalist and novelist, and this is advertisements for myself, which is all sorts of things, fiction, non-fiction, plays, what have you. And I was watching some interviews with Norman on YouTube, and basically some archive ones. And he was, one of the great American journalists, most famous for the war novel Naked of the Dead. And there was a joke by Woody Allen in which Woody Allen said, he donated his ego to the Smithsonian Institute. But I find him very sympathetic, and James is a big fan. And we were talking about Barry N. Malzberg, and you'll see this in this upcoming pub interview conversation, sort of literary salon thing. And he was saying how he felt that Mailer and Malzberg were the same in a very interesting way. And that got me looking back at Norman, so I've got that to read. And some specific things James said led me to buy A Fire on the Moon, which is Mailer's book about the Apollo program. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So it's a bit of non-fiction there. Going back to SF, this is a book I've wanted for a long time. It's a book that Faber first published way back in, I think it was the 60s. Let's have a look at the date. Let's see, 1969. It's a Danish novel. I'm trying to think what I've read any Danish SF. I've read some Dutch SF, but not Danish. And this is Tumush by Sven Holm. Very beautiful in Faber editions. And Faber, a publisher who I've been saying have kind of lost their identity, and they sort of blanded out, but they're digging at their archive and they're reissuing things, and this comes in wraps, which is really nice. And this is a post-apocalyptic novel set in a kind of resort where the survivors, who are rich, can have exclusive radiation-proof shelters, and they can enjoy sort of ambient music and what have you. And it's it's very, very interesting. And they discover that there are more survivors than people thought with this sort of apocalyptic thing. And, it all gradually starts to go pear-shaped. So it's very short and sharp, as you see. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And this is something to say. I mean, a lot of the most interesting publishing of science fiction isn't actually within genre SF these days. It's in, general fiction guise. And that's an indicator of how, one, the science fiction's always been out there in the mainstream corpus of literary fiction. And two, how more and more writers rely on SF tropes and SF conceits to say what they want to say about the contemporary world, because it's the only thing that makes sense. You can't pretend that technology isn't changing human consciousness, that it hasn't changed it. We've had a long time now since the Industrial Revolution, it's 150 years or more. And you know, it's the only way. You can't just have polite dinner party conversations anymore. That just won't wash if you want to deal with the reality of the world. Speaking of dealing with the reality of the world, this is a really good little science fiction writer who I have read some books by. This came out probably about 10 years ago. I've not got around to it. And this is No Harm Can Come to a Good Man by James Smythe. James looked like he was going to break through at one point. He's still very young. He's only about 40. He did a book called The Explorer, and it had several sequels, which was a space mission. And Explorer has quite a lot of ambiguity about it, but if you like sort of spaceborne narratives, it's certainly worth looking at, space exploration narratives. And I also read a wonderful book by him called The Machine, which reminded me of Frankenstein as if written by D.G. Compton, and it's a fantastic book, really, really good. He's also done some kids' books as J.P. Smythe, and he hasn't had the attention he deserves. And this is about a AI program which can predict the future very accurately, and it's about a guy called Lawrence Walker who wants to be president of the United States, and this AI program predicts that this guy will become president of the United States, and it'll be the worst thing to happen ever. But can he defy the predictions? Is the AI right? Is it a bit dead zone? We'll see. You know, can this AI, which seems to be able to predict everything, is it right or wrong? What's going to happen? So it's sort of political drama. This makes me think of things like America City by Chris Beckett, Two Tribes by Chris Beckett. If you haven't read Chris Beckett, there's a great interview with Chris on the channel, great British SF literary writer. And yeah, so I decided it was time to read another one of James's books, because he's very, very good. So I'm looking forward to that as well. God knows when I'll get around to all this stuff. You know how it is. So what else? Slight sideways step into crime here. I haven't read much crime in recent years because from about 2011 until about 2020 I read quite a lot of it, and I was running a international crime reading group at work, and I was very into my Italian crime, French crime, European crime is a particularly big thing. But my first wave of crime reading was probably from about 86, 87 to about 93, when I read a lot of the great classic American noir hard-boiled, Chandler, Hammett, Kane, and then people who came later like Richard Stark, a lot of that stuff, and I absolutely loved it. And I sort of kept up a bit, but crime's one of those things where every now and again I go to it and I burn it down. I find the people I like and then I stop. And I have had this urge, because this is somebody I've not read, and Scott Bradfield talked about him on his channel the other day. A friend of mine in work has said to me, you'd love him. I've always meant to read him, never have, and that's Ross MacDonald, The Underground Man. And I'm looking forward to that. It's in Penguin Modern Classics. They've done 4 of these. The detective is Lou Archer, and apparently the prose is very fine, and they sound quite Chandler-esque, but only in terms of the milieu, except it's slightly later, it's Los Angeles, and usually apparently in these there are sort of family secrets and uncovered. But I just felt I wanted to go back to a bit of classic American crime from the formative period, and this was published, I believe, let's see, 1971, so this is a later one. They were mostly sort of late 50s, 60s, I believe. But Penguin Classics, beautiful stuff. We can't go wrong. Something I'm very excited about, because I've waited literally for years for this, is a book which has just been issued by New York Review Books Press, and in their classic sort of semi-imprint. And this is Dina Bazarti'S A Love Affair. Now, Dina Bazarti is an Italian writer. He wrote one of the best novels I've read this century, which is a book called The Tartar Step. There is a video coming up on the channel just about Bazarti and his work. And he's a fascinating character. He was sort of born, let's see, 1906, died in 72. He was basically a newspaper man, and he wrote science fiction, fantasy, children's books, graphic novels, lots of reporting for the newspaper, and he worked on the production and management side as well, art critic. And Bazarti's book, The Tartar Step, which I would broadly categorise as a literary fantasy, is one of the most moving books I've ever read, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. And there's a video coming up very soon on the channel. I did one actually about a year and a half ago, but I had copyright problems with it because I included some snips from a film made of it, and that didn't go down too well with YouTube, so I had to watch that. And I decided to pull back, and I filmed some material about Bazarti in Italy, so it's going to be a sort of a hybrid thing. His work's always been really hard to get. There's a wonderful collection of short stories called Catastrophe, which are very surrealistic and strange. He actually wrote a story called Time Machine, a science fiction story, not the Wells one, of course. And the stories, they just tend to end without resolution. They're really weird. And this is a love affair, and it's about a guy who falls in love with a prostitute. So it's a very different sort of thing. So everything I've read by him is different. So he's fascinating. He's a guy who didn't let sort of things grow under his feet. And this is New York Review Books Classics, absolutely beautiful. They do a fair amount of SF. I'll do a little feature and show you what SF they do, because if you're in the States, some of them you can't get over here. They're really, really nice editions, and you guys would love them. They're beautiful, they really are. For me, after Penguin Modern Classics, the most important reissue in print in the world. So I'm really pumped for that. I'm looking forward to that. So that'll be a classic of modern Italian literature. And as I say, there's going to be a video about the Tartar Steppe coming up. He wrote a kid's book called The Bears' Famous Invasion of Sicily, and that's what it's about. It's about bears invading Sicily in the 1940s. It's completely wild. Famous book in the States, not very well known in the UK. So back to SF. A recent reissue from the very wonderful Strugatsky brothers. We love the Strugatsky brothers. And the great news, of course, is that there's more Strugatsky stuff in print now in English than there ever has been, which is good news. And this is The Beetle in the Anthill from Chicago Review Press. Well done, guys. And that's just come out. And this, a new translation, and it's gone afterward by Boris. And this is the second book in, I believe it's the second book. Is it the New Universe series they call it? But it's basically one of the sequels to The Inhabited Island, aka Prisoners of Power, one of my favourite Strugatsky brothers books, with Max Camera. Max is kind of like this sort of Russian Superman, you know, he's genetically perfect, he's beautiful, and he just, you know, life on Earth, on utopian communist Earth, is so boring, so he just zips around the cosmos in his spacecraft doing interesting things, and this is one of those. Now, there's also been another reissue at the same time, which I've struggled to get from Chicago Review, and that's The Waves Extinguish the Wind. So yeah, it is New Universe. So that's that one there. So that's a Strugatsky to watch out for. I don't think these are going to get into many bookshops. They are available in the UK, of course they're available in the States. And yeah, so this is going to be great, because I love Max, because Prisoners of Power, aka The Inhabited Island, and the Gollancz edition in the UK is now called The Inhabited Island. It's a new translation, though I didn't find it that different from the Prisoners of Power edition. It has it's rather like, how can I put it, Flash Gordon meets 1984, so it's got a real sort of like pulpy element, but it's got serious dystopian stuff as well. It's a great book. So yeah, so that's another Strugatsky for the pile. I've got a few I haven't read now. It's just embarrassment of riches. And I do have another one down there somewhere. I've got Far Rainbow somewhere, which I haven't shown you. So I'm going to disappear at a shot, and I'll be back in a second, because it's really too good to miss the opportunity. Let's see what we have. There you go, and there's the Far Rainbow, and this is like, it's like a print on demand, and the print is just terrible. So there you go. But yeah, so if you're working your way through all the obvious classics, through, you know, Hard to Be a God, Roadside Picnic, Monday Begins on Saturday, there's more out there. It's all good news. We're so lucky, aren't we? To wrap up, a non-fiction book, but a book with SF relevance. I hear you sigh with relief. It's not all about SF, you know. This has only recently come out, and I couldn't resist this. And for a long time, I'd always been in the situation here with my reading where I would never have any non-fiction to read. I'd buy a non-fiction book, read it, and that would be it. And I'd never have a like little TBR. I always want one, and I decided, you know, a couple of years ago to start buying more non-fiction, even if I didn't read it straight away. And now I've ended up with a pile of stuff, and some of it I don't fancy anymore, but there you go, it is what it is. But this, Attack Warning Red, How Britain Prepared for Nuclear War. Look at that. That's stentorian, isn't it? Isn't that great? And it's got these wonderful end papers, the old protect and survive thing. There we are. Because, of course, anybody who knows about Cold War Britain, particularly the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, will know that, you know, there were these really handy leaflets and booklets, you know, which were all about sandbags and saving tins of beans and stuff. So no use whatsoever. And this is by Julie McDowell. And apparently Julie is a freelance journalist and book critic specialising in the nuclear threat, Well, she must be fun at parties. And she's written for all sorts of newspapers and stuff. And she does a podcast called Atomic Hobo. So she travels to nuclear bunkers and stuff like that. What a great lady. She must be great fun. And yeah, so this is looking at the, not just the deterrent, but what we were supposed to do, duck and cover, protect and survive and all that. And of course, there were similar things in the States. They're not of any use whatsoever. But I thought I'd read that because I kind of love being terrified by these things. One of my favourite books in this sort of genre is a book called The Higher Form of Killing by Jeremy Paxman and Robert Harris. That's Robert Harris of Fatherland. And I've probably mentioned this before, and it came out before Fatherland. And when I met Robert, when he was doing a promotional tour to get Fatherland off the ground, this was before it was a bestseller, I said to him, I said, I read Higher Form of Killing and I absolutely loved it. And he said, you're probably the only person who did read it because it was a flop. And it was A Secret History of Gas and Germ Warfare. It was revised post 9/11. Great book. Read it. Fantastic. So that's what I've been reading. That's some stuff for the TBR pile. Will it ever end? There'll be a fantasy video coming up soon. There'll be a second episode of the Capri vlog. And then we start to go into the specific videos looking at specific books and writers related to that part of Italy. And, plenty more to come. It's just the time, really. I could be doing 3 videos a week. I'm just wired at the moment, as I say. It's just getting things, and the state of the hideout, you wouldn't believe it. And I've got domestic duties as well. I've got to get on with life. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you've been reading. And, I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.